Hey everyone, go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let the day settle down somewhere far behind you. Tonight, we're drifting back into the soft, slightly absurd world of royal history. The kind where crowns are heavy, egos are fragile, and family trees look less like elegant oaks and more like tangled hedges in desperate need of pruning. And while you relax, we'll wander through the dim corridors of European palaces. We'll peek quietly at the faces of kings and queens who were, according to the flattery of the time, noble, radiant, and divinely appointed, while in reality many of them resembled various fruits, pastries, or mildly startled poultry. It wasn't their fault. Generations of intermarriage tend to do that, but it does make for some wonderfully drowsy storytelling. So let's settle in, take a slow breath, let the blankets get heavy. And we'll begin with one of the most famous examples of dynastic enthusiasm gone too far, the Habsburgs, because of course it's the Habsburgs. The Habsburg jaw, a family tradition. Nobody wanted if Europe had a prize for most committed to keeping the bloodline questionably pure, the Habsburgs would take it. Every century without fail, this was a dynasty that looked at the entire continent and decided, very confidently, that they didn't need to marry anyone outside their own extended family. After all, why let a perfectly good duchy slip out of your hands when you can simply arrange a marriage between two people who share enough DNA to qualify as a set of matching socks? Their family motto may as well have been, if you can keep power through talent, try genetics, preferably your own. This devotion created the Habsburg jaw, also known as mandibular prognathism, or less clinically the oh dear of dynastic inheritance. Portraits of the family show a progression of increasingly elongated chins, drooping lower lips, and facial angles that defied both gravity and medical advice. And while we could begin with any number of Habsburgs, we may as well drift gently toward the one who became the most iconic example of the long-term consequences of limited spouse selection. Charles II of Spain. Charles II of Spain. The unfortunate final product, Charles II, sometimes politely referred to as Charles the Bewitched, was born in 1661. And the fact that he survived infancy was considered one of the great plot twists of the 17th century. His family had been intermarrying for so long that his own parents, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, were uncle and niece, which, in genetic terms, is basically selecting the hard mode setting for child rearing. Charles did not get the easy version. He was sickly from the beginning. His tongue was so large, he had difficulty speaking clearly until well into his childhood. He didn't walk until he was 4. He didn't speak properly until he was 8. And for reasons historians still debate, his caretakers fed him almost exclusively chocolate, which feels like a parenting strategy designed by a bored pastry chef rather than a royal physician. Growing up, Charles was surrounded by a court that insisted he was perfectly healthy. They said this because they were afraid of losing influence, but also because the alternative was admitting that the Spanish Empire, one of the biggest in the world, was now effectively being run by a man whose hobbies included staring into space and occasionally forgetting he was king. But Charles did try. He really did. He liked hunting, even though he couldn't ride well. He liked governing, even though he struggled to understand most of what was happening. He also enjoyed inspecting royal documents, which he reportedly did with the vague expression of someone trying to remember if they left the kettle on. And throughout all of this, Europe watched politely, pretending everything was fine, while quietly preparing for the moment he would eventually pass away, which he did at age 38 after a long, difficult life marked by illnesses, political chaos, and a level of exhaustion that probably matched how you're starting to feel right now. But Charles wasn't the only notable Habsburg. So, let's drift over to another figure a little earlier in the dynasty, whose facial structure was described bravely by his contemporaries as memorable. Maximilian I, the father of the Habsburg brand. Maximilian I reigned as Holy Roman Emperor from 1493 to 1519. He was, by all accounts, charming, ambitious, and extremely committed to the Habsburg strategy of marrying into kingdoms rather than winning them on battlefields. His approach can be summarized as, why conquer a territory when you can marry someone who already owns it? This worked astonishingly well. Through a series of marriages, the Habsburgs acquired Burgundy, Spain, the Low Countries, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. It also meant that, by the time Charles II came along, his ancestors all shared so much DNA that family gatherings were more like looking at multiple copies of the same portrait. Physically, Maximilian had an early version of the Habsburg jaw. It wasn't severe, yet just enough to make his lower face jut forward with quiet confidence, like a chin that was trying to lead a small army. Over the next few generations, this eventually turned into the full architectural structure we see in portraits of Philip IV and Charles II. Maximilian, to his credit, was deeply interested in science, culture, and the arts. But he was also fond of personal extravagance. He once commissioned a massive mechanical clockwork monument that was so complicated, so expensive, and so physically large that only a fraction of it was ever completed. Much like his descendants' health, the project was ambitious but structurally unsound. Still, he laid the groundwork for the dynasty's future. And by future, I mean centuries of royal cousins marrying slightly closer royal cousins. For reasons that can best be described as politically convenient but medically regrettable. But Europe offered plenty of dynastic curiosities beyond the Habsburgs. So we'll drift, slowly, softly, over to the British Isles, where the royal families were also occasionally fond of marrying relatives, though with slightly different consequences. The Stuarts, a dynasty built on misfortune and mild chaos. The Stuart dynasty, which ruled Scotland and later England, didn't reach Habsburg levels of inbreeding, but they made up for that with sheer unpredictability. Their family motto should have been something like, "We tried. Truly, it just didn't work out." Let's start quietly with James VI of Scotland, who also became James I of England in 1603. James was intelligent, scholarly, and extremely talkative, according to everyone who ever had a conversation with him. His courtiers reportedly developed the ability to nod politely for hours while he explained his latest theory about kingship, scripture, or why hunting was the ultimate spiritual experience. James had chronic health issues, weak legs, tremors, and a tendency to drool. He walked with a rolling, awkward gait that made him look as though he were constantly trying to regain his balance. His wardrobe didn't tee up. He wore padded doublets, stuffed with so much material that he resembled a nervous armchair. His marriage to Anne of Denmark was complicated, partially because they didn't speak the same language, and partially because she had a personality and he had ideas. But They did produce heirs, including the ill-fated Charles I, who was executed in 1649, and Elizabeth Stuart, whose descendants would eventually inherit the British throne as the Hanoverians. James's personal habits were eccentric but harmless. He was terrified of knives. He loathed tobacco. He wrote lengthy treatises arguing that witches were real, also insisting he personally could identify them on sight, which must have been tremendously reassuring to everyone in the room. But while the Stuarts were entertaining, they weren't quite as genetically entangled as other royal families. For that, we drift toward the Russian court, the Romanovs' beauty, fragility, and hemophilia. The Romanovs, unlike the Habsburgs, were generally considered attractive. Portraits show elegant features, symmetrical faces, and the serene expressions of people who believed they were chosen by God to rule, to suffer, or sometimes both. But the dynasty had one major hereditary problem: hemophilia, a blood-clotting disorder that entered the family through Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She passed the gene to several of her children, who then married into Europe's courts like well-meaning genetic ambassadors of mild disaster. The most famous Romanov affected by hemophilia was Alexei, the only son of Nicholas II and Alexandra. His illness shaped the entire final chapter of Imperial Russia. Every injury, every bruise was a crisis. His parents lived in constant fear. Court physicians were baffled. And Alexandra, desperate for help, eventually turned to the mystic Rasputin, whose influence contributed to the unraveling of public trust in the monarchy. But Alexei wasn't the only fragile royal child. Several descendants of Queen Victoria struggled with the disorder. Their lives were often quiet, sheltered, and filled with dull medical routines. If you're feeling your eyes getting heavy, it matches the mood of their days slow, careful, and punctuated only by the sound of anxious relatives speaking in hushed tones. Royal fragility wasn't limited to blood disorders, though. Some families suffered from mental instability, mild or severe, brought on by generations of close marriages. Which brings us to perhaps one of the most unfortunate rulers in French history. Charles VI of France, the king who forgot he was King Charles VI, known somewhat insensitively as Charles the Mad, reigned from 1380 to 1422. In his early years, he was charming, athletic, and promising. Then, slowly, his mental health began to deteriorate. He experienced delusions, paranoia, memory loss. At one point, he became convinced that his body was made of glass. He wore reinforced clothing and refused to let anyone touch him. This condition, called the glass delusion, appears in several medieval accounts, and while it sounds bizarre today, it made perfect sense within the anxieties of his time. The worst episode came when Charles suddenly forgot who he was. He forgot he was king. He forgot his wife. He forgot, at one point, that he had children. He wandered the palace with the distant, unblinking focus of someone trying to remember where they left their keys, where the entire kingdom of France. While Charles struggled, France slipped into chaos. His relatives fought over regency. His court split into factions. The English invaded, and Charles, lost in his own mind, drifted through rooms filled with anxious nobles who hoped he'd recover, even as they quietly prepared for the likelihood that he wouldn't. It was tragic, but also deeply characteristic of royal lines where genetics and stress combined into a dangerous cocktail. If you're settling deeper into the blankets, that's good. That's exactly what these monarchs would have wanted. Mostly because if you fell asleep while they were talking, they'd consider it a sign of respect. Tonight, we continue drifting through the quiet, dimly lit gallery of Europe's most genetically confused dynasties. The air is soft, the floorboards creak like old memories. And as we move forward, we'll let ourselves sink a little further into the strange, drowsy comfort of royal misfortune. We left off with Charles VI of France, the king made of glass. But France, ever devoted to dramatic continuity, decided to follow him with generations of rulers who weren't quite fragile in the same way, but who still had more than their share of unlucky genetics and unfortunate life choices. So let's drift gently toward another corner of the French monarchy, where the Bourbon dynasty was preparing its own assortment of dramas, misunderstandings, and bloodline quirks. Louis XIII, the quiet king with the loud court Louis XIII, grew up in the aftermath of his father Henry IV's assassination, which meant he was thrust onto the throne at age 9. A child king tends to create problems. A shy, physically frail child king creates even more. Louis was pale, thin, and famously introverted, basically the royal equivalent of a startled fawn. He had a high, soft voice. He avoided confrontation whenever possible. He preferred music to politics and pigeons to people. He also managed, in the hands-off tradition of unlucky monarchs, to hand most of his authority to Cardinal Richelieu, who ran France with the energy of a man who slept 3 hours a night and enjoyed political purges far too much. Louis's personal life didn't help his dynastic situation. He and his wife Anne of Austria, yes, from the Habsburgs, because of course she was struggled to produce an heir for over 2 decades. Courtiers whispered, physicians theorized, astrologers made unhelpful predictions. Louis, reportedly, had such intense social anxiety that he sometimes fled his own wife's chambers before even attempting intimacy. But eventually, 2 sons were born, Louis, the future Louis XIV, and Philippe, the future Duke of Orleans, whose flamboyant personality would later provide exactly the kind of courtly color Louis XIII so carefully avoided. Still, the Bourbon line had its peculiarities, which brings us softly, slowly, to the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, glorious, gilded, and genetically not great Louis XIV, known as the Sun King, ruled for 72 years, the longest of any major European monarch. His portraits portray him as radiant, ageless, glowing with divine authority and excellent wig care. But beneath all that silk and sunlight, Louis carried the same narrow Bourbon jawline and drooping features that had followed his family for generations. He wasn't unattractive, just very much a Bourbon. His eyes drooped slightly downward, giving him a perpetual expression of faint disappointment, as though he had just witnessed someone sit incorrectly on an expensive cushion. Louis had good health for most of his life, which was remarkable, considering his lifestyle consisted mainly of overeating, dancing, and admiring himself. But even he wasn't immune to royal ailments. In his later years, he developed severe gout, gangrene, and constant digestive problems, likely a result of consuming monstrous quantities of meat, wine, and a beverage made of boiled bull's urine, which was considered medicinal. Naturally, it did not help. His children and grandchildren fared worse. Many died young, either from illness or the general Bourbon propensity toward looking at a fever and saying, "It's probably fine." By the end of his life, Louis outlived almost all his heirs, leaving the throne to his great-grandson, a 5-year-old child who probably didn't understand why he was suddenly expected to rule a kingdom larger than his own attention span. But France wasn't alone in breeding royal fragility. Let's float eastward toward a dynasty famous for its melancholic charm and spectacular self-destruction. The Wittelsbachs, Bavarian blues, mystics, and questionable genetics. The Wittelsbachs ruled Bavaria for centuries, and to put it gently, they were a family known for their intense personalities. If the Habsburgs specialized in chin elongation, the Wittelsbachs specialized in eccentricity and mental instability, part hereditary, part environmental, part nobody ever told them no, because they were royals. Their family tree is sprinkled with individuals who heard voices, saw visions, or believed they were made of otherworldly substance. But one of the most memorable members was King Ludwig II, sometimes called the Swan King, the Fairy Tale King, or by frustrated Bavarian ministers, we need him to stop spending money. Ludwig was born into privilege, loneliness, and a genetic background that read like a psychological red flag. He grew up isolated, sensitive, and enamored with Wagnerian opera, a dangerous combination for a monarch with access to a national treasury. He built dazzling castles inspired by myth, music, and his own imagination. Neuschwanstein, the most famous, looks like something a romantic architect would sketch after eating too much marzipan. Ludwig rarely governed, preferring moonlit carriage rides and dramatic correspondence. He wasn't exactly unstable either. His reign was marked by increasing withdrawal, financial problems, and an eventual deposition by ministers who decided Bavaria needed fewer swans and more practical budgeting. His mysterious death, found floating face down in a lake alongside his psychiatrist, has fueled endless theories. But in keeping with the soothing tone of our evening, we won't dive into the darker ones. We'll just say it was very on brand for a dynasty that specialized in ethereal chaos. And speaking of dynasties with unfortunate hereditary issues, let's drift back west toward the British Isles again, where the Hanoverians were preparing their own catalogue of peculiarities. The Hanoverians, nervous tempers, odd habits, and too many Georges. The Hanoverian dynasty came to power in Britain in 1714, thanks to the fact that every Stuart with a claim was either Catholic, dead, or dramatically unqualified. So, Parliament looked through the extended family tree and selected George I, a German prince who spoke almost no English and whose personality could best be described as lukewarm porridge. George I had the classic Hanoverian look, round face, heavy jaw, slightly alarmed expression. This would become a family trademark, but the most famous Hanoverian health issue was porphyria, a metabolic disorder that caused abdominal pain, neurological symptoms, and sometimes hallucinations. Modern historians debate which monarchs actually had it, but the most famous candidate is George III, known popularly and a little unfairly as the Mad King. George III, the monarch who tried very hard. George III wasn't mad in the way people imagine. For most of his life, he was stable, conscientious, and serious, basically a man who looked like he had been born middle-aged. He loved farming, astronomy, and long walks. He avoided mistresses, which confused everyone in his court, who viewed adultery as a polite social hobby. But George's health issues gradually took hold. He suffered bouts of intense abdominal pain, insomnia, rambling speech, and deep confusion. During one episode, he talked for hours without stopping. During another, he tried to shake hands hands with a tree, believing it to be the king of Prussia, which, as mistakes go, is fairly harmless. The tree didn't seem to mind. His illness worsened until he was blind, nearly deaf, and permanently confused. His son, the future George IV, became regent, though given George IV's lifestyle, regent mostly meant attends parties while father slowly deteriorates. The Hanoverians had other hereditary issues. For one, George IV's chin. George IV, a Bourbon chin on a Hanoverian face. George IV inherited more than the Hanoverian roundness. He combined it with his mother's Bourbon features, producing a lower facial structure so large that caricaturists began using his silhouette as shorthand for extravagant monarchy. He was vain, indulgent, and surprisingly fragile. He suffered from gout, obesity, high blood pressure, and the general health consequences of drinking wine the way other people drink water. Tailors struggled to keep up with his waistline, genuinely stressful profession during his reign. By the time he became king, George IV was essentially a collection of medical conditions loosely held together by satin waistcoats. But enough about chins and gout. Let's drift northward, where Scandinavian royals were quietly producing their own dynastic curiosities, dramatic but wonderfully odd in their own gentle way. The Oldenburgs, Danish delicacy, loneliness, and a very unlucky queen. The Oldenburg dynasty ruled Denmark and Norway for centuries. Their hereditary issues were less physical and more emotional along lines of shy, introverted monarchs who struggled with melancholy and isolation. Among them was Queen Caroline Matilda, an English princess married off at age 15 to King Christian VII of Denmark. Christian VII was complicated. He suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, or a related condition, and spent much of his time engaging in erratic behavior. He would beat his servants, mimic people's voices, or throw food during official dinners. Court physicians tried everything from bleeding to cold baths, none of which improved his condition. Caroline Matilda, lonely and ignored, eventually formed a close relationship with the king's physician, Johann Struensee. Whether they were lovers or simply found solace in each other's company remains debated. What is clear is that Struensee began running the government, modernized it, reformed it, improved it. Naturally, the nobility hated him, and naturally, they staged a coup. Caroline Matilda was exiled, Struensee was executed. Christian VII continued to deteriorate. It was one of those classic European royal tragedies, avoidable and gently depressing, perfect for falling asleep too. The Windsors, modern, polished, and still carrying their share of oddities. Now we drift toward the present. We won't discuss living individuals in detail, but historically speaking, the Windsors inherited the Hanoverian jawline, the tendency toward respiratory issues, and the general British royal tradition of being slightly unwell at inconvenient times. Edward VIII had digestive problems. George VI had chronic anxiety and a stutter that worsened under stress. Their father, George V, had a lower facial structure reminiscent of earlier Hanoverians, alongside a series of ailments caused largely by cigarettes, reportedly up to 20 a day. Even the much idealized Victorian era produced heirs who were fragile, nervous, or simply unsuited for ruling. Hemophilia persisted in various branches of the family, and cousin marriage continued well into the 19th century, not extreme, but enough to maintain a certain familial sameness in portraits. But with modern medicine, most of these hereditary issues became manageable. The days of 18-generation inbreeding spirals have thankfully passed, which brings us to a sleepy, gentle transition. Let your breathing soften. Let everything around you get a little slower, a little blurrier, like an old tapestry fading in candlelight. Tonight, we slip further into the quieter corners of royal histories, sick rooms, and guarded chambers where Europe's most important children were raised with astonishing formality and astonishingly poor medical advice. Royal heirs were, in theory, precious. In practice, they were often treated like decorative porcelain teapots, admired from a distance, handled by strangers, and occasionally dropped. So let's drift gently into the world of sickly royal childhoods, a world where toddlers wore ermine, infants had personal priests, and nobody, absolutely nobody, believed in fresh air, fragile beginnings. The medieval and early modern royal nursery, medieval royal children, were not raised by their parents. They were handed over to wet nurses, governesses, tutors, physicians, and whatever assortment of attendants the court felt like assigning. The reasoning was simple. Kings and queens were too important to be involved in raising their own offspring. Also, to be completely honest, most monarchs just didn't know how to parent. The royal nursery was usually located in a drafty wing of a castle, where the only heating came from fireplaces that produced more smoke than warmth. Infants slept swaddled in stiff fabrics. Toddlers wore miniature versions of adult clothing right down to the restrictive shoes and unnecessary hats. Healthcare was, well, it existed, but just barely. Physicians believed babies were essentially wet lumps of fragile humors that could be improved with vigorous bleeding herbal concoctions of dubious origin, and regular doses of wine, which everyone seemed to think cured everything, so it shouldn't surprise us that royal children were often pale, thin, and sickly. And this brings us floating to one of the most famously unhealthy royal heirs of all time, Edward VI of England. Edward VI, the boy king with the immune system of a Victorian houseplant. Edward VI was the long-awaited son of Henry VIII and was treated accordingly like a holy relic with a pulse. He was surrounded by attendants at all times. Nobody breathed near him. He was fed carefully prepared meals, bathed in warm linens, and educated like a scholar prince in training. Yet despite all this, Edward was heartbreakingly frail. He suffered from chronic respiratory issues, constant fevers, and periodic bouts of exhaustion. Accounts describe him as bright and intelligent, but physically delicate, with a thin neck and a chest that rattled ominously whenever he exerted himself. Henry VIII adored him in theory, but whenever Edward became ill, the king slipped into a familiar cycle of denial, despair, and blaming other people. Court physicians attempted every treatment imaginable, including cupping, purging, applying hot irons, and administering syrups that would horrify modern medicine. Edward's brief reign after Henry's death was marked by political manipulation and overwork, which probably didn't help his health. He died at just 15, most likely from tuberculosis, a disease that thrived in cold, smoky, poorly ventilated Tudor palaces. Yet despite the tragedy, Edward wasn't the only fragile royal boy produced by England's illustrious bloodlines. Let's drift gently ahead to his cousin, a young man with perhaps even worse luck, James Henry Frederick, the boy who sneezed too hard in a manner of speaking before we reach the better-known James VI. The Stuart line produced an earlier heir, Prince Henry Frederick, the eldest son of James VI of Scotland. Henry is one of history's great what-ifs, a brilliant, promising prince whose life was cut short by illness, But lurking nearby was his younger brother, Charles, the future Charles I, whose childhood reads like a medical case study on perhaps royalty should go outside occasionally. Charles was born weak, sickly, and unable to walk properly. He had rickets, a condition caused by vitamin D deficiency, common among royal children who spent more time in gilded chambers than under the sun. As a toddler, Charles needed leg braces. He had trouble standing. He coughed constantly. When the court moved from castle to castle, he was carried like a fragile parcel. He survived, but just barely. His health improved over time, but he retained a reserved, anxious temperament likely shaped by early vulnerability and lifelong pressure. This combination would later play a major role in his inability to navigate political conflict, though tonight we keep our focus gentle, far from the battlefield. Charles's childhood reminds us that fragile royal heirs were not limited to any one era. For that, we need only drift forward to the most famously sheltered royal brood of the 19th century, the children of Queen Victoria. A dynasty of nervous constitutions. Queen Victoria had 9 children, and nearly all of them were raised with the same mixture of rigid discipline, emotional distance, and questionable medical oversight. Her parenting style can be summarized as love them from afar, criticize them up close. Many of the children inherited anemia, fragile health, stiff posture, and the family tendency toward melancholy. But the most infamous case, as we touched upon earlier, was hemophilia, passed to her son Leopold and to several grandsons scattered across Europe like genetically unfortunate diplomatic gifts. Prince Leopold, the prince who had to sit still. Leopold, Victoria's 8th child, suffered from severe hemophilia. Even minor bumps caused massive internal bleeding. He was forbidden from rough play, climbing stairs, or doing anything remotely fun. He grew up intelligent, artistic, and understandably lonely. Victoria adored him, but in her own overwhelming way, insisting that he needed constant supervision. Leopold often described himself as a caged bird. He died young after slipping on a polished floor. Another reminder that royal palaces were, in many ways, architectural hazards waiting to happen. But the Victorian era didn't corner the market on fragile royal children. For one of the most heartbreaking examples, we float softly back to Russia. Alexei Romanov, the boy who lived quietly, carefully, and always at risk. Alexei Nikolaevich, the long-awaited son of Nicholas II and Alexandra, was born in 1904, lively and dangerously fragile. He inherited hemophilia through his mother, whose lineage traced back to Queen Victoria. Every bruise was a crisis, every fall was an emergency. Even climbing into a carriage required layers of padding. Alexandra became consumed with anxiety. Nicholas withdrew into private worry. The court tiptoed around the air as though one wrong movement might cause catastrophe. Alexei, for his part, grew up kind, playful, and acutely aware of his limitations. His illness shaped the final years of the Romanov dynasty. But in this quiet retelling, we set aside the darker end of the story. Tonight, we simply acknowledge a childhood spent in shadows, silks, and whispered concern. Now, let's drift away from the tragic and toward the mildly ridiculous because, as it turns out, some royal children were not fragile due to genetics, but because they were raised with habits that destined them for lifelong incompetence. Louis XV, the child raised by too many people. Louis XV became king at age 5. When you make a 5-year-old the center of a political universe, things rarely go smoothly. He was raised by a governess, a a secondary governess, the king's widow, multiple tutors, several wet nurses, and a rotating cast of relatives who mostly wanted influence. This produced a child who was shy, easily overwhelmed, and prone to sudden illnesses, many of which were likely stress-induced. Louis suffered fevers, digestive problems, and chronic fatigue. He had little socialization outside his palace, which left him anxious in public and overly dependent on advisors. Despite becoming an adult monarch, Louis XV retained many traits of his overly sheltered childhood. Fear of sudden noises, dislike of crowds, tendency to hide behind curtains during awkward moments, and a preference for staying in bed for large portions of the day. One could argue he was the original work-from-home enthusiast, but Louis XV's ailments were mild compared to the unnamed, uncelebrated royal children who quietly faded from the historical record, especially those born with congenital issues caused by Europe's intricate web of cousin marriages. Let's drift closer to one such example, the Spanish infantes, a dynasty of delicate babies by the 1700s. The Spanish Habsburg branch had collapsed, but the Bourbon rulers who replaced them inherited the same problem the dynasty started with: excessive intermarriage. Spanish infant mortality was staggering. Dozens of royal babies died in infancy, often from respiratory illnesses, congenital deformities, immune weakness, and, inevitably, poor medical care. Queen Maria Louisa of Savoy died at 25 after multiple pregnancies that left her increasingly fragile. Her surviving children were thin, pale, and frequently ill. One infant prince reportedly coughed so weakly that palace staff could barely hear him. Even the crown prince, future King Ferdinand VI, spent his childhood prone to fainting spells, melancholy, and nervous tremors. Court physicians recommended fresh air, but only in controlled amounts, which defeats the purpose entirely. The result was a generation of rulers who lived cautiously, nervously, and often miserably. But not all fragile royal childhoods were due to sickness. Some were due to, well, being raised very strangely. Frederick William II of Prussia, the boy raised like a little soldier. Across Europe, some monarchs believed the key to producing a strong heir was strict discipline, very strict discipline. The kind of strictness that made drill sergeants say, "Are you sure?" Prussia perfected this approach. When Frederick William II was a child, his tutors dressed him in tiny military uniforms, marched him around the palace grounds, and taught him to disassemble firearms before he could read. His father, Frederick William I, the so-called Soldier King, believed tenderness was a suspicious foreign concept. The boy's childhood was predictably miserable. He developed chronic anxiety, stress-induced fainting, and a lifelong fear of military noise. He grew into a passive, indecisive adult, unsurprising for someone raised in conditions that would make a modern therapist rub their temples. But for all his difficulties, Frederick William survived, which is more than can be said for far too many royal children born into fragile bloodlines. So let's drift toward the saddest pattern of all: the hereditary weakness of the last Capetians. The later Capetian kings of France suffered from a quiet but persistent problem. They had trouble producing healthy male heirs. Louis X died suddenly, possibly from poisoning or pneumonia. His posthumous son died at just 5 days old. Philip V struggled with chronic illness and fathered only daughters who survived childhood. His brother, Charles IV, managed his sons, both of whom died in infancy. By 1328, the direct Capetian male line had completely failed. This wasn't due to any single condition. but generations of intermarriage among French Navarrese and Burgundian cousins produced a line of increasingly fragile infants unable to thrive even with the best care available. This dynastic collapse led directly to the Hundred Years' War, but tonight we simply observe the more peaceful version of events. A soft, fading series of royal cradles, each emptied too soon. If you're still with me, comfortably sinking into your pillow like a medieval baron collapsing under the weight of his own chainmail, then good. We're drifting deeper tonight into the gentle chaos of European royalty. And naturally, we're returning to the Habsburgs, because when it comes to dynastic oddities, they really are the gift that keeps giving, even long after the gift should have stopped. Just settle in, slow your breathing, let your shoulders drop, and let us meander into another quiet century or so of family decisions that really should be come with warning labels. Continuing with the Habsburg problem, so when we last left the Habsburgs, they were learning slowly, painfully, and usually too late that marrying your niece wasn't actually a sustainable genetic strategy, but stopping the habit. Now that would require a level of common sense that dynasty simply did not stock. After Charles II of Spain, our sweet, bewildered, medically impossible Charles, we might imagine that the Habsburgs re-evaluated everything. Perhaps they sat down at a massive table, stroked their various beards, and said, "All right, let's try marrying people we aren't related to." But no. Instead, imagine a collective shrug. A sort of, well, it worked out fine for great-great-uncle Ferdinand, so what's the worst that could happen? They had not read a health textbook, or rather, they had read only one, and it was apparently upside down, and so they persisted. Let's drift to Leopold the First, the mildly startled poodle of emperors. Leopold. I was the Holy Roman Emperor in the late 1600s. He possessed a famously Habsburg jawline, so pronounced that portraits struggled to pretend otherwise, and an expression that suggested someone had just whispered unpleasant news in his ear at all times. His contemporaries described him as pious, cautious, and unfailingly polite. He also looked a bit like a dachshund trying to remember where it buried a bone. Leopold's marriages, well, they continued the trend. First, he married Margarita Teresa of Spain. She was his niece. Yes, we're starting strong. Margarita Teresa was also the girl in the famous painting Las Meninas, the one by Velázquez, where a small child stands, radiating the general vibe of someone who just realized adults are staring at her again. She was lovely, gentle, and unfortunately extremely inbred, shockingly so. The kind of family tree where several branches loop back around and high-five each other. She and Leopold were close in age, but genetically about 10 people too close. She died young, which, tragic as it was also extremely common in her family. Her children didn't fare well either, and Leopold naturally remarried another Habsburg relative. Because if you fall off the horse, get back on the same horse, but also marry the horse, apparently, the wars he sort of slept through. Leopold spent much of his rule wading through endless wars, mostly against the Ottoman Empire, sometimes against France, and occasionally against the general concept of peace. To be fair, he did reasonably well, or rather, his generals did well, while Leopold stayed safely tucked in palace rooms decorated in gold leaf and mild anxiety. But the poor man lived at the mercy of his own genetics. He suffered a range of chronic health problems thanks to the family's relentless genealogical recycling program. Leopold's face alone was a study in what happens when your great-grandparents are also cousins. That jaw, the legendary Habsburg jaw, was now large enough to qualify for its own minor dukedom. Portraitists tried to help him out, but there's only so much soft lighting can do. His children, a study in fragility, most of Leopold's children, unsurprisingly, inherited the family's usual problems. Several died in infancy. Others reached adulthood, but with the typical assortment of ailments that made people whisper things like, well, at least he can still walk, as though that were an optional skill. One child, Joseph I, actually grew up healthy-ish, shockingly so. Inbreeding can be unpredictable. Sometimes it gives you Charles II staring blankly into the void, and other times it gives you a surprisingly functional human. But Joseph I also died young of smallpox, because the 18th century was like that. His brother, Charles VI, then took over. This is the Charles who would later be the father of Maria Theresa, who, by the way, becomes one of the more impressive Habsburgs. But we'll drift to her later. For now, we stay with Charles VI, a man who meant well, but often felt like the universe's favorite chew toy. Charles VI, the emperor who wanted a son very, very badly. Charles VI's entire adult life can be summarized as, I hope my next child is a boy, followed by, well, that didn't work. The poor man had daughters, several of them, and each time he sighed deeply, changed political alliances, issued decrees, petitioned nobles, and started a whole new war just to guarantee his daughters could inherit something. And those bureaucratic gymnastics eventually created the Pragmatic Sanction, an extremely fancy document that said, please, for the love of everything holy, let my daughter Maria Theresa inherit the empire without everyone throwing a tantrum. Europe nodded. Said, of course, Charles, no problem at all. And then immediately, threw the biggest tantrum imaginable, the very second Charles died, because of course they did, but that's a sleepier, later issue. Charles VI's personal life, a quiet parade of follies. Charles wasn't as unhealthy looking as the Spanish Habsburgs, but the genetic shadows lingered. He struggled with migraines, digestive issues, and the kind of chronic indecision that made diplomats consider new career paths. His hobbies included obsessively hunting but badly, funding alchemists who promised to make gold they did not, drinking vast quantities of Austrian wine, worrying about his lack of a male heir, and overseeing an empire that kept bursting into flames. He was also famously superstitious. He believed in omens, signs, and prophetic animals. Once, he reportedly delayed a council meeting because he saw a crow behaving suspiciously. In his defense, the bird probably was plotting something. Crows usually are, but it's still not ideal imperial leadership. Let's drift to the Austrian court itself. The Habsburg court under Charles VI was an interesting blend of extreme luxury and absolutely none of the fun. Imagine miles of marble halls, gold-trimmed doorways, and chandeliers heavy enough to cause structural concerns. But everything is conducted in total silence, at a slow pace, under layers of regulations written by someone who clearly enjoyed paperwork far too much. Guests had to follow elaborate rituals just to approach the emperor. You couldn't smile too much. You couldn't speak unless spoken to. You couldn't sneeze without risking someone noting it in a court diary. The Spanish court, for comparison, was even worse, but we'll drift back to them later. Meals were formal, conversations muted, fashion ruled by etiquette older than most of the furniture. The whole place was like living inside a museum run by a committee of stressed-out accountants. And yet, Despite all the rules, the palace was constantly full of gossip, mostly about marriages, illnesses, and who fainted during Mass this time. Charles VI and the family pattern like his ancestors. Charles married within the usual narrow gene pool. His wife, Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, was actually not a close Habsburg relative, and this was considered shockingly progressive. Of course, to balance things out, the rest of the dynasty continued marrying cousins with the dedication of people absolutely committed to a theme. Charles VI's daughters, however, Maria, Theresa, most famously would begin shifting the entire trajectory of the family. But that's for another soft, drowsy part of the night. For now, let's stay in the late 1600s and early 1700s, where the Habsburgs are still bravely marching forward, blissfully unaware of genetics, and entirely too comfortable with their own family tree collapsing inward. A very sleepy palace life. Let's take a moment to drift into the rhythm of court life at the time. Imagine waking up in a massive, drafty palace chamber. You're covered in blankets embroidered with lions that look like confused house cats. A servant enters to open the curtains, slowly, ceremonially, as though revealing a surprise that is, every morning, simply weather. Then you sit for breakfast. You don't get to choose the food, because nothing in your life is about personal preference. You eat whatever is placed before you. It might be fruit, it might be cold meat, it might be something labeled pudding, but filled with ingredients no modern person recognizes. Servants stand silently behind you, watching you chew, which is a relaxing thought to fall asleep to, I'm sure. Your day proceeds from ceremony to ceremony. Occasionally, someone faints due to tight clothing. Occasionally, someone marries their cousin. Occasionally, someone dies of smallpox. Everything is orderly, everything is gilded, and everything feels faintly absurd. A brief drift toward the we should have seen this coming moment. The dynasty had been accumulating genetic damage for centuries. Charles VI knew what had happened in the Spanish branch. Everyone did. Charles II of Spain had become a kind of cautionary tale, whispered about at banquets in the way one might whisper about a supernatural occurrence. And yet, the Austrian Habsburgs didn't change course much. They slowed the rate of intermarriage, yes, but didn't eliminate it, because stopping would mean strengthening alliances with outsiders. And outsiders, naturally, couldn't be trusted, especially not people with normal jawlines, suspicious. So the Habsburgs tried to inch toward healthier marriages while still clinging to their traditions. The result was a sort of halfway improvement, enough to keep the Austrian line running, but not enough to fully escape the swirling cloud of hereditary health issues that followed them around like a dedicated pet. The stage is set for Maria Theresa. By the time Maria Theresa was born, the dynasty was hard, well, fragile, exhausted, and quietly panicking about the future. But that's exactly where we want to be as we drift toward the next part. A gentle cliff, if you will, flagged, soft, and entirely without danger. Just a moment where the candles are burning low in the palace corridors and the empire hums faintly with nerves. We'll follow her story in the next segment. We'll watch the Habsburgs try finally to untangle centuries of questionable choices. And we'll keep wandering through their peculiar, extravagant, utterly avoidable problems. For now, just relax. Let the silly grandeur of it all settle into the background, and let the next royal fiasco drift a little closer. Slowly, quietly, like a courtier approaching the emperor with news he won't enjoy. If you've made it this far, gently drifting through the layers of velvet and powdered wigs, then I'm glad you're still awake, or honestly, half asleep works too. Tonight, we're sinking into the quiet glow of early 18th century Vienna, where the candles burn low and everyone looks faintly worried. This, of course, is where Maria Theresa enters the stage, a woman destined to rule, mostly because nobody else was left. Let's just relax, let your breathing settle. We're wandering forward through one of history's busiest courts, solely softly, like a very tired chamberlain who has been awake since dawn. Maria Theresa arrivis. Eventually, Charles VI, that anxious, mildly unlucky emperor from the last part, finally welcomed the daughter in 1717. Not the son he hoped for, not the heir he envisioned, but Maria Theresa was healthy, which was already a major accomplishment for a Habsburg child. Her birth was greeted with relief, frustration, and the sound of distant European kings whispering, "This will be a problem later." Maria Theresa had that rare Habsburg quality. She looked normal, not jaw-heavy, not unusually shaped, just fine, almost suspiciously fine. Imagine the court physician squinting at the infant like, "Is this allowed?" She grew into a sturdy, charismatic girl who loved riding horses, singing, and ignoring her father's carefully crafted diplomatic plans. A refreshing change from the fainting, coughing, trembling heirs of previous generations. But there was one small, delicate issue. The moment Maria Theresa existed, every European power began circling like gossiping relatives, already predicting chaos when she eventually inherited everything. The Pragmatic Sanction, Europe's least respected document. Charles VI spent the better part of 2 decades begging, bribing, negotiating, threatening, pouting, and writing very long letters so that other monarchs would sign the Pragmatic Sanction, which basically said, "When I die, please don't steal everything. Let my daughter rule peacefully. Please, I'm serious, please." And Europe said, "Of course, certainly, anything for you." And then immediately, absolutely everyone planned to ignore it. Imagine Charles holding this beautifully sealed legal decree like it's his security blanket, unaware that every other monarch is crossing their fingers behind their backs. Maria Theresa's childhood, pretty, polite, and surprisingly unprepared, despite being the future ruler of a giant, complicated empire. Maria Theresa's education was soft, very soft, like decorative pillow soft. She learned dancing court etiquette, singing more dancing, some religion, even more dancing she did not learn, statecraft, finance, military strategy, how to recognize territorial theft in progress. Her father thought it was unbecoming to teach a girl politics, even if the girl would one day run the whole show. So instead, he just hoped the empire would behave itself. An adorable misunderstanding of how empires work. As Maria Theresa grew older, she became known for her beauty by 18th century standards, which included large hair and a posture that suggested a certain command presence. People liked her. She glowed, she radiated warmth and mild confusion. Court officials found her charming. Foreign visitors found her impressive. Her father found her comforting. Nobody found her prepared. Enter Francis Stephen, the husband she actually liked. Royal marriages usually resembled business transactions conducted by people who had never met each other and sometimes shared several grandparents. But Maria Theresa, shockingly, she fell in love. The lucky man was Francis Stephen of Lorraine, soft-spoken, warm, pleasant, a man whose hobbies included smiling politely and not starting wars, a radical concept in the 18th century. They married in 1736. Court gossip went wild, especially because Maria Theresa genuinely adored him, and Francis seemed equally smitten. This horrified some of her advisors. A ruler who actually liked their spouse. Unprecedented, potentially dangerous. But Maria Theresa didn't care. She liked her husband. She liked being near him, and she would continue liking him loudly and enthusiastically, producing 16 children and a great deal of affectionate correspondence. Yes, 16, because of course she did. Then her father died, and absolutely everything fell apart when Charles VI died in 1740. Maria Theresa inherited, well, technically, she inherited an empire, but more accurately, she inherited broken finances, corruption, a neglected military, a crumbling bureaucracy, half a dozen unpaid armies, mountains of debt, and Europe sharpening its knives. She was 23, pregnant, untrained, and deeply startled to discover her father had left her roughly 3 shillings and a pile of unsent paperwork. The moment he died, the very same monarchs who signed the Pragmatic Sanction tore it up in unison, yelling things like, "Actually, we never said that, and I call dibs on Silesia." Frederick the Great of Prussia in particular sprinted into the chaos with the enthusiasm of a raccoon discovering an open garbage can. He invaded Silesia so quickly that Maria Theresa barely had time to finish her mourning period, and thus began the War of the Austrian Succession, a conflict that spanned continents, destroyed alliances, and made Maria Theresa cry in meetings on more than one occasion. Maria Theresa's surprising glow as a ruler. Here's the thing. Nobody expected Maria Theresa to be good at ruling. She didn't even expect it. But as one crisis piled onto another, she discovered, wait, she could govern, she could rally troops, she could negotiate, she could inspire loyalty. She was, in fact, extremely competent. The empire responded to her leadership with something like, "Oh, she knows what she's doing. That's new." She reformed taxes. She reorganized the army. She hired competent ministers rather than decorative aristocrats whose only skill was collapsing attractively during ceremonies. Imagine her advisors watching her with mild terror, thinking, "She's functioning. She's making decisions. She's good at this. What do we do now?" Francis Stephen, the emperor who wasn't really in charge. Maria Theresa loved her husband sincerely, but politically, she treated him like a decorative throw pillow. Francis was crowned Holy Roman Emperor, but this was mostly symbolic. Maria Theresa continued ruling everything with firm, determined hands, while Francis wandered around looking genial and confused. He spent most of his time managing finances decently and fathering children very effectively. He was gentle, stable, and supportive, like a weighted blanket with diplomatic training. Maria Theresa appreciated him, but she did not tolerate interference. If he offered political advice, she listened politely and ignored it at once. Their relationship was affectionate and unbalanced in the most mutually agreeable way possible. 16 children. Really, 16. Let's drift through the nursery, which was less a room and more a small nation. 16 children arrived over the years, including Joseph II, the extremely intense heir Leopold II, the calmer, spare Marie Antoinette, the copy-paste version of Maria Theresa, several Marias who died young, a grim but common pattern. Maria Theresa insisted on personally raising them, or rather, personally supervising the people who did the actual raising. She adored motherhood. She adored babies.
She adored naming every daughter Maria, something which must have been wildly confusing at dinner time.
But she also micromanaged their lives with the precision of a watchmaker performing surgery. If Maria Theresa had access to modern parenting blogs, she would have run them all. Her reforms, competent, effective, and mildly bossy. Once she stabilized the empire, Maria Theresa went on a quiet reform spree. She centralized the state, improved education, strengthened the military, modernized administration, reduced noble privileges, introduced a more efficient tax system, started smallpox vaccination programs, and generally behaved like the empire's strict but caring mom. She believed her subjects needed structure. Lots of structure, preferably with uniforms. Her policies weren't always gentle, but they were effective. The Austrian Empire, deeply broke, finally exhaled a bit. Her grief and the slow, soft decline. Francis Stephen died in 1765. Maria Theresa, who had remained passionately attached to him for decades, was devastated. She wore widow's black for the rest of her life, deep, heavy mourning clothes, like the world's saddest, most ornamented shadow. Her political energy dimmed. She grew more religious, more cautious, more melancholy. Her son Joseph, now co-ruler, had the energy of a caffeinated philosopher, desperately trying to modernize everything at once. Maria Theresa constantly scolded him for being too radical, too fast, too enthusiastic, too much like someone who believed the Enlightenment was a good idea. Their relationship could best be described as two people arguing about government until one of them goes to bed early. The end of her story. And the transition to something new. Maria Theresa died in 1780. She left behind a strengthened empire, reformed institutions, a complicated legacy, 16 children, several geopolitical headaches, and a family tree slowly escaping its inbred past. But only slightly. She was competent, emotional, opinionated, stubborn, and deeply human, a refreshing contrast to the Habsburgs who came before her, many of whom resembled wilted houseplants. And as we drift onward, the stage passes to her son Joseph, intense, idealistic, and absolutely ready to fight with every noble on earth. But that, of course, is where we'll float next time. For now, close your eyes, let the palace fade into soft candlelight, and rest in the comforting knowledge that even the mightiest empires once relied on a single, anxious, determined young woman simply trying to hold everything together. If you're still with me, nestled comfortably under a blanket, drifting somewhere between consciousness and a vaguely historical dreamscape, then perfect. We're gliding gently into another chapter of Habsburg eccentricity, because of course the dynasty isn't done with us yet. Tonight, we're settling into the soft, flickering glow of late 18th century Vienna. The air is thick with candle wax and political anxiety, and in the center of it all stands Joseph II, Maria Theresa's eldest surviving son, a man who burst into government like someone who read half of a philosophy book and immediately tried to reorganize an empire. Just let your breathing slow, let your eyelids grow heavy, and float with me into the life of one of Europe's most intense, over-ambitious, chronically frustrated rulers. Joseph II, born serious, stayed serious. Joseph was born in 1741, the same year his mother was still scrambling to defend the throne from half of Europe. He grew up during war, uncertainty, and the quiet sound of his mother anxiously reorganizing entire ministries at breakfast. Unlike Maria Theresa, who was warm and expressive. Joseph had the emotional tone of a man who had accidentally swallowed a philosophy dissertation. He was intense, idealistic, easily irritated, and determined to fix the world even if the world didn't ask for it. Where Maria Theresa ruled with maternal firmness, Joseph ruled like a sleep-deprived professor trying to enforce a new syllabus. Portraits show him with that classic Habsburg seriousness, the slightly raised eyebrows of a man constantly disappointed by humanity. Joseph's education, books, lectures, and not much fun. Joseph was educated in the way only heirs to giant empires can be, surrounded by tutors, books stacked to the ceiling, and daily lectures on things like how not to lose Bohemia. He read constantly philosophy, history, political theory, military strategy. He devoured Enlightenment texts the way some people devour pastries. Voltaire, Montesquieu, Rousseau. Joseph interpreted them all as direct, personal instructions. His worldview became, reason solves everything. Tradition is suspicious. People should simply listen to me because I've thought about this very carefully. This approach would eventually cause, well, several revolts, and one extremely annoyed Hungarian nobility, and a general vibe of, oh no, he's doing it again. But young Joseph, he believed in progress, sincerely, enthusiastically, a little too enthusiastically. His relationship with Maria Theresa, mother versus son, tradition versus enlightenment. Maria Theresa loved Joseph deeply, but she also saw him as a dangerous combination of smart and impulsive. Their conversations often went like this. Joseph, mother, I read a new book, and here's my 40-point plan to reform the empire. Maria Theresa, absolutely not. Joseph, but Maria Theresa, still no Joseph, but it's rational. Maria Theresa put the philosophy book down. So their Karul, starting in 1765, was less shared governance, and more Maria Theresa running everything, while Joseph sulked in the background writing essays no one asked for. He wanted radical change. She wanted stability. He wanted to modernize every law at once. She wanted him to calm down. They loved each other, but they argued frequently, warmly, stubbornly. For two rulers trying to share an empire, they had the energy of roommates debating whether the kitchen needs reorganizing. Maria Theresa won almost every argument, but when she died in 1780, Joseph was finally free, and oh, he was ready. Joseph too becomes sole ruler and immediately starts changing everything. The moment Maria Theresa's funeral ended, possibly before the candles were fully extinguished, Joseph II unleashed his long-suppressed reform agenda. He became a legislative machine. If a system existed, he wanted to overhaul it. If a law was more than 10 years old, he wanted to rewrite it. If a tradition annoyed him, and many did, he wanted it abolished immediately. His central philosophy was simple: if it doesn't make sense, we don't need it. Unfortunately, centuries of entrenched nobles, provinces, church authorities, guilds, and communities felt differently. Joseph moved fast, too fast. He reformed the empire at the speed of someone trying to finish all their homework the night before it's due. What Joseph changed, which was basically everything, let's drift gently through his reform list, which reads less like normal governance and more like a man frantically reorganizing a bookshelf during a midlife crisis. He abolished serfdom. He replaced local laws with centralized ones. He imposed religious tolerance. He reorganized education. He limited the church's power. He created new civil rights. He restructured monasteries like someone pruning a hedge too enthusiastically. He modernized the tax system. He tried to streamline the court. He tried fatality to change Hungarian traditions. He modified burial practices. Yes, burial practices. His new system required economical burials, including reusable coffins. The public response was somewhere between horror and absolutely not. Joseph thought he was being efficient. Everyone else thought he was losing his mind. Joseph II's personality: earnest, lonely, overworked. Despite his flaws, Joseph II was earnest. He genuinely wanted to help the poor. He genuinely wanted equality. He genuinely wanted progress. But emotionally, he was deeply isolated. His first marriage to Isabella of Parma was the great tragedy of his life. Isabella was brilliant, elegant, and adored by everyone, except Joseph, who adored her too much. She died young of smallpox. He never recovered. He never remarried for love. He never really opened up again. He buried himself in work, in reform, in frustration. Joseph had the inner melancholy of someone who overthinks everything and then reorganizes the entire postal system at 2 in the morning. The empire responds. Please stop. Joseph wanted gratitude. He got resistance. Every group objected. The nobles were furious about losing privileges. The church was furious about losing influence. The Hungarian Diet was furious about everything. Peasants were confused by new systems they didn't understand. The Austrian bureaucracy was exhausted. Belgian provinces revolted outright, and Venetians sent politely annoyed letters. Everyone agreed on only one thing: Joseph needed to calm down. He didn't. The Hungarian revolt, a very predictable disaster. Hungary had strong traditions, a proud nobility, and no desire to be reformed by the imperial equivalent of a well-meaning tornado. Joseph refused to be crowned King of Hungary because coronation ceremonies were too traditional. This was not well received. He also tried to replace the Hungarian administrative language with German. This was even less well received. He tried to abolish old Hungarian laws, and that was the final straw. Hungary revolted quietly, politely, and very firmly. It wasn't dramatic, just a widespread, slow, stubborn refusal to follow orders. The political equivalent of an entire nation crossing its arms and saying, no. Joseph's late years, exhaustion, regret, and illness. By the late 1780s, Joseph II was worn down. Europe was tense. Prussia was antagonistic. The Ottoman War was going badly. The Belgian provinces had declared independence. Hungary was furious. Vienna was muttering. And Joseph was tired. Deeply tired. The kind of tired where you stare at your own paperwork and wonder why you thought any of this was a good idea. In 1790, sick with fever and stretched thin by stress, he revoked almost all his reforms. Years of work gone in one melancholy sweep. He wrote a heartbreaking note. I have made many mistakes. Everything I attempted for my people has turned against me. I am unlucky in all things. And not long after, he died, unmarried, exhausted, unfulfilled, beloved by very few during his life, but admired by historians long after. He left behind a tangle of half-implemented reforms, a restless empire, and a reputation as the Enlightenment's most tragic overachiever. A quiet reflection before we drift onward. Joseph II was one of history's strangest contradictions. A deeply caring ruler who irritated everyone, a reformer who moved too fast for reality, a visionary blocked by the limits of the world he inherited. He wasn't easy to like, but he was easy to understand. A man who wanted desperately to fix what was broken and broke himself in the process. But the story doesn't stop with him. The Habsburgs continue. Of course they do. Next time, we'll drift toward Leopold II, Joseph's calmer brother, who had the misfortune of inheriting an empire held together with string, hope, and abandoned legislation. But for now, let your mind settle softly. Let Joseph's earnest intensity fade into the background, and rest in the most powerful rulers are sometimes just tired, lonely people trying their best. Settle in, soften your breathing a little, and let whatever nonsense the day handed you finally dissolve. Tonight, we gently returning to the dimly lit halls of Europe's ruling families, the ones who should have been powerful, majestic figures, but instead often resembled anxious, overgrown houseplants with access to armies. We've spent quite a while traveling through time together, drifting past fragile kings, melodramatic dukes, and queens with enough repressed fury to power a mid-sized city. So let's keep floating along. No rush, no tension. Just quiet footsteps echoing through yet another royal corridor where someone important is probably pouting. Tonight, we'll wander into the worlds of rulers, but we're extremely on brand for their time. That means chronic bad decisions, chronic bad health, and chronic insistence that the universe owed them something. So let's dim the lights a little more and drift back in. We begin with Charles VI of France, the one who forgot he was human. If you've ever had a moment where you questioned your identity, like catching your reflection at 2 a.m. and wondering why you look like you just escaped from a tax audit, don't worry. Charles VI did the same thing, just more dramatically. Charles VI ruled France from 1380 to 1422. His reign began with promise. He was young. He was handsome in the medieval nobleman who might also be a decorative wall, tapestry way. People called him Charles the Beloved. That didn't last, because Charles eventually became Charles the Mad, which is a less flattering nickname, though undeniably accurate. By his mid-20s, Charles began having psychotic episodes. Some were violent, some were delusional, and one became famously bizarre. He believed his body was made of glass. Yes, glass. A whole king of France walking around with the anxiety level of a decorative wine goblet. He wore reinforced clothing so he wouldn't shatter. He banned people from touching him. He refused to move too quickly. The entire royal household had to pretend this was normal because, they valued keeping their heads attached. This went on for years. France drifted along, not unlike a ship steered by a nervous pottery figurine. Meanwhile, his relatives took turns ruling on his behalf. This was a problem, because European royal households had a habit of putting the term functional government in the same category as unicorns and responsible budgeting. So the regents fought and schemed, and occasionally staged armed brawls that probably resembled family game night, but with more armor. France fell deeper into the 100 Years' War. Charles fell deeper into his fragile glass-body world, and by the time his reign ended, the kingdom was in tatters. But hey, at least he never shattered. That's something. Let's drift over to Joanna of Castile, the Infanta who loved too hard. Next, we float to Spain, soft golden light, quiet stone courtyards, and the gentle echo of someone loudly losing their mind over a cheating husband. This is Joanna of Castile. History remembers her as Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, which is rude and not entirely fair. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same pair who sent Columbus on his exciting little miscalculated boat trip. She wasn't meant to rule, but thanks to her siblings' unfortunate habit of dying or producing inconveniently fragile heirs, the crown landed on her lap. Joanna had a brilliant mind, sharp, well-educated, politically aware. Naturally, this made everyone uncomfortable. Then she married Philip the Handsome, who, just to be clear, was handsome in the smirking at himself in reflective surfaces way. He enjoyed being admired, preferred flirting with half of Europe, and treated marriage like a suggestion. Joanna fell deeply in love with him. He treated her feelings like they were mildly annoying insects buzzing near his wine. Their relationship spiraled into jealousy, rage, passion, and whatever emotional category exists between I adore you and I hope your horse trips. After Philip's sudden death, Joanna famously refused to part with his corpse. She traveled across Castile with his coffin, insisting he remained by her side. People interpreted this as madness, but honestly, considering her life's circumstances, a little coffin-related attachment is almost reasonable. Her father took advantage of the situation, declared her unfit to rule, locked her in a convent for decades. She wasn't mad, she was inconvenient, and medieval politics had a habit of confusing those two things, floating toward Rudolph II, the Habsburg who collected absolutely everything. Now, let's drift to Prague during the late 16th century, a time when the Habsburgs were at peak Habsburg energy, which means a lot of chin, a lot of nervous political decisions made in tall, drafty rooms. Rudolph II was Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He lived in Prague Castle, a place with enough Gothic vibes to qualify as a moody teenager. Rudolph was intelligent, but let's say softly disconnected from practical reality. He had anxiety, depression, and a general desire to avoid everyone. He governed as if ruling were an optional side hobby. Instead, he collected things, everything. Paintings, sculptures, animals, mechanical toys, random objects that looked interesting. Alchemists, for some reason, he filled the castle with astrologers, mystics, inventors, and men who claimed they could turn lead into gold. Spoiler, they could not, but they did enjoy the free meals. The empire slowly crumbled while Rudolph wandered hallways packed with curiosities. He owned exotic animals he had no idea what to do with. He collected precious stones he never cataloged. He acquired scientific instruments he didn't use, and he occasionally forgot to answer diplomatic messages for months. Eventually, his relatives stepped in. They removed him from power with the kind of resigned exhaustion usually reserved for taking scissors away from a toddler. But Rudolph left behind an extraordinary legacy of art and scientific patronage, and a castle that resembled a thrift store run by a particularly whimsical dragon. Now we drift to Christina of Sweden, the queen who said no, thanks, Sweden. Silence, shadows stretching across a royal palace full of people who had no idea what their queen would do next. Christina became queen at 6 years old after her father, Gustavus Adolphus, died in battle. She was raised like a prince, taught statecraft, philosophy, war, languages, and the art of wearing whatever clothes she felt like. Contemporaries never stopped remarking on her mannish behavior, which usually meant she refuses to be decorative furniture. Christina, headstrong, restless, and deeply uninterested in marriage, despite the entire European nobility showing up like anxious contestants on a royal dating show. Instead, she pursued learning, collected art, corresponded with philosophers, drove her advisors insane by refusing every marriage proposal with the shrug of someone declining a store loyalty card. Then at age 27 she abdicated, just stepped down, said she was done, retired from monarchy like it was a job with poor benefits. She converted to Catholicism, moved to Rome, and lived her best life surrounded by scholars, musicians, and the occasional scandal just to keep things interesting. Her cousin took the throne. He probably needed a long nap afterward. And finally, a quiet wander toward the tragic life of Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria. Let's drift to the late 19th century. Austria-Hungary, land of polite bureaucracy, complicated family dynamics, and pastries designed to soothe generational trauma. Crown Prince Rudolph was the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elizabeth C., the restless beauty who spent most of her life trying to escape court obligations. Rudolph inherited both parents' emotional instability, but none of their coping mechanisms. He was intelligent, politically liberal, and increasingly depressed by the rigid imperial system he was expected to uphold. His marriage was miserable. His health was poor. He drank heavily and sought excitement in all the places that usually end badly. In 1889, he and his young lover Mary Vetsera died together at Merling. The details remain debated. Murder, suicide pact, a tragic accident. The Habsburgs, uncomfortable with emotional transparency, covered it up with the efficiency of people used to sweeping things under elaborate carpets. His death destabilized the empire, set off a chain of succession problems, and cast a long shadow that stretched all the way to the empire's collapse. But Rudolph himself, he was just another royal, weighed down by expectations no one could meet. A lonely figure drifting through ornate rooms, wishing he were anywhere else. Let's just settle into the silence here as we leave these rulers behind. Charles, the glass-bodied king, Joanna, the misjudged queen, Rudolph, the anxious collector, Christina, the runaway monarch, and Crown Prince Rudolph, lost between 2 centuries. Notice how similar they all are. Not in power, not in brilliance, not in their wildly questionable decision-making, but in their fragility. Royalty loved to appear invincible, untouchable, blessed by God, fate, or whatever celestial entity was available in the 14th century. Yet behind the crowns, they were anxious, lonely, confused, petty, and often terrified of responsibilities they couldn't escape, just like everyone else, only with better architecture. Take a slow breath, let the stories settle. Let the old palaces fade into the distance. If you're still awake, congratulations, you've outlasted several medieval monarchs during council meetings. If you're drifting off, perfect. Just let my voice soften into the background while we take one more quiet wander through history's most unraveling nobles. Tonight, we'll move through a few more palaces where the tapestries were expensive, but the decision-making was not. A few more ruling families who tried their best, failed spectacularly, and made sure chronic incompetence stayed a hereditary trait. So sink a little deeper into your pillow, let your breath slow, and let's float onward to rulers who prove that even with all the wealth, power, and glittering nonsense in the world, you can still be deeply, profoundly chaotic. We begin with Henry VI of England, the king who truly wanted a nap. Before we begin, let's set the mood. England, 15th century, cold, damp, a country suffering through the Wars of the Roses, which were basically prolonged family therapy sessions with swords. At the center of this whirlwind, Henry had the misfortune of inheriting the English throne as a baby, and the misfortune of inheriting France shortly after. Countries, it turns out, are less cute gifts than footy pajamas. Henry grew into a gentle, bookish man, a king who preferred praying to waging war, reading to politics, and probably would have been happiest as a mildly anxious librarian. He founded Eton, which proves he was capable of making decisions, just not the ones England desperately needed during a civil war. Henry suffered from periods of catatonia, sometimes for months. His mind simply shut off, like a Windows 98 computer encountering a large spreadsheet. During these episodes, he wouldn't speak, wouldn't move. Once, his wife Margaret of Anjou gave birth, and Henry didn't react, not even a polite "oh." Neat. You can imagine how reassuring this was to the nobles. Then came his rival, Edward IV, towering, charismatic, a king shaped like a rugby forward with better clothes. People found Edward refreshingly competent, which tells you a lot about their expectations at the time. The crown switched hands, then switched again. Henry drifted in and out of captivity. And when the poor man finally lost his life in the Tower of London, it felt less like a political assassination and more like England whispering, "We're giving you a rest now." Henry VI wasn't cruel, or power-hungry, or even particularly misguided. He was just exhausted. A man who wanted peace in a century that aggressively refused to provide it. Let's drift over to Ivan VI of Russia, the forgotten baby emperor. Now we float east into the chilly air of Russia, where palace intrigue was less of a political phenomenon and more of a national hobby. Ivan VI holds one of history's strangest resumes. He became Emperor of Russia at 2 months old. Yes, months. An infant equipped with absolutely no military experience and only the vaguest understanding of where his own hands were. He was overthrown at barely more than a year old by Elizabeth Petrovna, and from that moment on, Ivan lived one of the bleakest royal lives imaginable. He spent his entire life imprisoned, moved from fortress to fortress, hidden away like a state secret, crossed with a forgotten Christmas ornament. The guards were told not to speak to him, not to teach him anything, not to reveal his identity. The result, Ivan grew up isolated, developmentally stunted, and heartbreakingly unaware. When he reached his teens, someone finally told him who he was. And naturally, because his choices were limited to accept your fate or attempt coup in extremely bleak conditions, he attempted a coup. It didn't go well. Ivan was killed during the chaos at just 23, a life that went from cradle to coffin without ever touching freedom. History often forgets him, which feels almost fitting. He was a czar who never got to be a person. Next, we drift quietly toward Charles II of Spain, the final fragile Habsburg. If there were an award for most unfortunate genetics, Charles II would win so easily it wouldn't even be polite. By the time he was born in 1661, the Habsburg family had spent centuries marrying cousins with the enthusiasm of people collecting matching dinnerware sets. Charles II was the result. Let's set the scene. He was nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched, which is a dramatic way of saying we refuse to take responsibility for our own questionable family tree. Charles struggled with nearly every bodily function. He had speech difficulties, digestive problems, severe developmental disabilities. He didn't walk until he was about 8, didn't speak clearly until much later, and required constant care. Despite this, he was still King of Spain. His court spent decades attempting to hide the severity of his condition, blaming everything on sorcery, curses, or misaligned stars, basically everything except the obvious inbreeding chart hanging over the dynasty like a chandelier. Charles was gentle, sweet-natured, often confused. He tried so hard to be a proper monarch, but paperwork and statecraft were essentially foreign languages to him. His marriages, 2 of them, never produced heirs. Partly because Charles was physically unable. Partly because the universe had very clearly decided this bloodline needed to stop. When Charles died at 38, the Habsburg dynasty Spanish branch died with him. It was a mercy for everyone involved. Let us wander softly into the world of Ludwig, the second of Bavaria, the dreamer who spent a little too much. Our next stop takes us to Bavaria. Mountains, fairy tale castles, all thanks to one man, Ludwig II. Ludwig was passionate, imaginative, and slightly allergic to ruling. He disliked public events, disliked interacting with ministers. In modern terms, Ludwig was the kind of person who would email instead of attending a meeting ahead of his time. He adored Wagner's operas, adored art, and most of all, he adored castles that cost more money than Bavaria reasonably had. Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, each one an architectural daydream, financed by loans and Ludwig's unwavering belief that budgets were a concept invented to personally irritate him. His ministers panicked, his relatives panicked, his creditors panicked. Eventually, they declared him insane. A claim still debated today. Was he mentally ill, or simply introverted, theatrical, and catastrophically bad with finances? They deposed him, placed him under medical supervision, and just days later, Ludwig was found dead in a lake alongside his psychiatrist. To this day, the details remain murky. But Ludwig left behind something extraordinary: castles that look like they were designed by a man with access to sugar, caffeine, and an unlimited Pinterest board. He may not have been a great king, but he was an exceptional dreamer. Now, drifting toward Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the beauty who wanted to be anywhere. Else, it's only fair that we speak about Sissy now, since her son, Crown Prince Rudolph, drifted into our last part like a tragic afterthought. Sissy was famous, ethereal, a woman praised for beauty that required enough maintenance to qualify as a full-time profession. Her ankle-length hair alone took hours each day. She was obsessed with exercise, with dieting, with slipping away from the suffocating Viennese court whenever possible. Being empress bored her. Court life suffocated her. Her mother-in-law micromanaged her. Her husband, Franz Joseph, was polite but emotionally beige. Sissy spent years roaming Europe. Hungary adored her, which helped, but she was never still, never anchored, never comfortable in her role. She lost 2 of her children young. suffered from depression long before anyone had a useful term for it, and carried grief like a shadow. Despite her struggles, she became an icon symbol of romantic tragedy, rebellious glamour, and deep, persistent sadness. She once said, "I am a seagull, no one can catch me." And she lived like it, a woman forever drifting. We drift one last time amidst history's restless royal souls. These monarchs, Henry VI, Ivan VI, Charles II, Ludwig II, Sisiar, a peculiar collection, a king who couldn't stay conscious, a baby emperor who never saw the world, a Habsburg who collapsed under his genealogy, a Bavarian dreamer lost in his own castles, an empress who felt like a bird trapped in an empire, each powerful, each fragile, each shaped more by circumstance than choice. Their stories aren't dramatic thrills. They're soft, heavy sighs across history, whispers of people overwhelmed by roles they didn't choose or couldn't survive. As we drift away from them, let the noise fade, let the palaces grow dimmer, let the heavy velvet curtains fall gently back into place. You can close your eyes if you haven't already. If you're still awake after 8 parts of fragile monarchs and their equally fragile political decisions, impressive. You've survived more royal incompetence than most medieval subjects ever did. But if you're barely conscious, floating somewhere between wakefulness and sleep perfect, that's exactly where we want to be. Tonight, we're drifting into the lives of a few more rulers who were, let's say, unexpectedly human. People born into crowns who would have been much happier as gardeners, scholars, or people who simply didn't have to deal with chronic palace drama. So tuck yourself a little deeper into your blankets. Let the room soften into quiet shadows, and let S move gently into another set of royal lives that unravel under the soft glow of candlelight. We begin with Mary I of England, the Queen trapped between faith, fear, and a terrible PR team. Mary I is one of those historical figures who desperately needed better branding. Because when your nickname becomes Bloody Mary, your reputation isn't exactly trending in a positive direction. But let's drift back to the beginning. Mary was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, couple famous mostly for eventually hating each other loudly and legally. As a young girl, Mary was intelligent, warm, well-educated. She played instruments beautifully. She wrote letters that didn't sound like they were composed by a confused tax accountant. Everything was looking promising. Then Henry decided he wanted a different wife, and a son, and a church that let him switch wives like seasonal footwear. Mary was declared illegitimate, cut off from her mother, emotionally bruised in ways that polite history books don't quite emphasize enough. By the time she reached the throne as an adult, Mary was a woman shaped almost entirely by fear, insecurity, and the belief that God was grading her decisions. She intended to restore England to Catholicism, and she did it with the zeal of someone who'd been spiritually bullied for decades. Her burnings of Protestant dissenters were horrific, cruel, and tragically unnecessary. But in her mind, she was saving souls, not destroying bodies, which is the kind of catastrophic logic several monarchs specialized in. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain didn't help. He found her earnestness exhausting. She found his indifference devastating. Together, they achieved almost nothing besides making each other more anxious. Mary died young, lonely, and remembered badly. But underneath the political flames and religious turmoil, she was just another damaged royal caught between personal wounds and public duty. A queen who never stood a chance. Now let's drift quietly toward Emperor Nero, Rome's most theatrical disaster. Nero, Rome's favorite cautionary tale. A man whose greatest ambition was to be a performer. But unfortunately, he also ran an empire. Imagine a dramatic theater kid who suddenly inherits absolute power. That's Nero, just with more marble and significantly worse advisors. Nero wasn't destined to rule, but his mother Agrippina, the younger, had ambitions sharp enough to cut stone. So she maneuvered him into the throne with a combination of political pressure, strategic marriages, and the sort of emotional manipulation that probably deserves its own encyclopedia entry. Once Emperor Nero spent less time managing the Roman state and more time practicing musical performances no one wanted to sit through. Senators endured hours of his warbling because leaving was considered treason. People faked applause with the desperation normally reserved for hostage situations. Then there was the Great Fire of Rome. Rumors swirled that Nero started it, or didn't, or maybe sang dramatically while it burned. History likes to embellish. What we do know is that Nero used the vacant land to build a massive palace with a 120-foot golden statue of himself, which is the sort of architectural choice that says, please overthrow me immediately. His mental health declined, his paranoia increased, family members died under suspicious circumstances, he remarried and then remarried again. At one point, he married a young man named Sporus, whom he had castrated to resemble his deceased wife. You know, standard imperial coping strategies. Eventually, Rome revolted. Nero fled, and when the end came, he died whispering, "What an artist dies in me," which is honestly on brand. But despite all the chaos, Nero was, at his core, a lonely man performing for a world that never wanted him on stage. Next, we drift to Wilhelm II, the Kaiser who wanted respect and mostly got headlines. Let's move into the early 20th century, when Germany was ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man powered almost entirely by wounded pride and mustache wax. Wilhelm was the eldest grandchild of Queen Victoria, born with a paralyzed left arm due to a traumatic birth injury. He spent much of his life overcompensating with dramatic speeches, stiff military uniforms, and a desperate need for admiration. He wanted to be a great ruler, a great military strategist, a great diplomat. Unfortunately, he was none of those things. He had the emotional stability of a deflating balloon. He fired advisors constantly, wrote letters longer than Tolstoy novels, usually full of contradictions, and delivered speeches that made his ministers quietly consider early retirement. He offended Britain regularly, annoyed France, worried Russia, and occasionally managed to stress out his own generals. By 1914, Europe was a powder keg, and Wilhelm, bless him, wandered around with a lit candle, insisting everything was fine. He didn't start the First World War alone, but he certainly helped steer it into motion with the confident cluelessness of someone who shouldn't be operating heavy machinery. When Germany lost the war, Wilhelm fled to the Netherlands, where he spent his final decades sulking in a lavish estate. He chopped wood, complained about modern fashion, and insisted that democracy was a passing fad. In a different life, Wilhelm might have been a mildly eccentric schoolteacher, or a man who wrote very long complaint letters to newspapers. But as a Kaiser, he was a walking diplomatic incident. Let's drift now to Catherine de' Medici. Motherhood, poison rumors, and pure Renaissance exhaustion. Our next figure is surrounded by whispers, mostly about poison and political scheming, and maybe summoning dark forces because people in the 16th century had the same rumor. modern internet forums. Catherine de' Medici, married into the French royal family at 14, was ignored for a decade by her husband, who preferred his mistress, and then found herself ruling behind the scenes as her sons became a trilogy of increasingly ineffective kings. France at the time was a mess. Religious wars, civil conflict, nobles who acted like toddlers with access to cavalry. Catherine did what she could, which often involved political maneuvering so subtle that people assumed sorcery must be involved. She used spies, marriage diplomacy, occasional intimidation, and a talent for staying alive in conditions where most people would have been trampled by metaphorical and sometimes literal horses. And yes, she was blamed for the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Unfairly, partially, completely, always. But behind all the rumors and accusations was a woman trying to navigate a collapsing kingdom while keeping 3 fragile sons on thrones they had no idea how to occupy. She wasn't a witch or a poisoner or a monster. She was simply a mother in the most stressful job imaginable. Lastly, tonight, we drift into the unsteady world of King George III, the monarch who tried his best while his mind betrayed him. Let's soften the room once more and drift toward Britain. George III is remembered mostly for losing the American colonies and suffering from mental illness because when history summarizes you, it tends to choose the most dramatic bullet points. But George wasn't a bad king. In fact, he was diligent, devoted, fond of farming, passionate about science, and surprisingly wholesome for a man surrounded by political chaos. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and stayed devoted to her. They had 15 children, which suggests either a healthy marriage or very few hobbies. But beginning in midlife, George endured recurring bouts of mental breakdowns possibly caused by porphyria or bipolar disorder, or a combination that still sparks debates in medical history circles. During episodes, he rambled endlessly, spoke so fast no one could understand him, had sudden bursts of energy, and occasionally tried to shake hands with trees. The government stepped in, his son took over as regent, and George spent his final years in seclusion, blind, deaf, and lost inside his own mind. It's tragic, quietly heartbreaking, but also deeply human. He tried, he did his best, and his best simply wasn't enough against the chemistry of his own brain. And as we leave these rulers behind, Mary I, with her lonely, fearful devotion, Nero craving applause in a world that mocked him, Wilhelm II, desperate for respect he never earned, Catherine navigating a kingdom large enough to collapse on her, George III lost inside the storms of his own thoughts, each one powerful, each one wounded, each one strangely relatable in their own quiet way. As the night grows deeper, let their palaces dim, let their voices fade, let their worries drift away like dust in candlelight. Settle in, adjust your pillows, let your shoulders drop just a little more. In this part, we'll drift into the quieter corners of royal history. The places where the arguments happened behind satin curtains, where marriages were arranged with the enthusiasm of someone choosing which leftover vegetable to eat first, and where the most powerful women in Europe were often reduced to ceremonial wombs with unexpectedly sharp opinions. Tonight, we wander through the lives of a few queens and princesses who, despite being wrapped in gold-threaded linens, still managed to land in situations that would make even the most patient insomniac sigh softly and say, "Well, that's unfortunate. So let's drift into the world of royal women who were expected to smile, even while everything around them fell apart in spectacularly predictable ways. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the walking political headache. Let's start with Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who, in the calmest possible terms, was entirely too interesting for the men around her. Born fabulously wealthy, famously attractive, and inconveniently intelligent, Eleanor entered the world as the Duchess of Aquitaine, one of the richest lands in France. This already made her a problem for absolutely everyone, because powerful medieval women were viewed the way one might view a suspiciously large cat: intriguing, potentially useful, but likely to claw someone's face off. Eleanor was married at 15 to Louis VII, the King of France, who was, how to put this gently, extremely devout, extremely serious, and possibly the least compatible man for her on the entire continent. He wanted a wife who resembled a quiet church candle. Eleanor more closely resembled a bonfire with opinions. Still, the royal marriage went ahead, and just to keep things restful, it went poorly. Louis VII adored pilgrimages and fasting and avoiding fun. Eleanor adored travel, music, politics, and not being treated like a piece of expensive furniture. Their marriage lasted 15 years. During that time, Europe witnessed them attempting to function as a couple in ways that looked, despite their titles, remarkably like two people forcing themselves through a bad date they couldn't escape. They even went on the Second Crusade together, which was essentially the medieval equivalent of let us save the relationship by taking a disastrously long vacation. It did not help. The only thing it achieved was proving to the entire world that they shouldn't be married, and that Eleanor would be much happier with someone who understood that a queen is not a quiet, decorative item. When their marriage was finally annulled, Louis agreed with the wistful relief of a man finally allowed to take off shoes that never fit. Eleanor rode off, free as the breeze, right into the arms of Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. And this, of course, was a terrible idea. Henry was brilliant, energetic, fiery, the kind of man who could start an argument with a wall. Their marriage produced 8 children, a political empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, and the kind of domestic drama that medieval poets absolutely lived for. Henry had affairs. Eleanor plotted with her sons against him. The royal household resembled a very tense family reunion, held permanently at a low simmer. But for all its conflict, Eleanor's life was extraordinary. She ruled, she traveled, she survived prison, she outlived most of her enemies, and she remained through sheer endurance, one of the most powerful royals Europe ever produced. Not bad for someone who began her life as a political inconvenience. Let's drift onward. Isabella of France, the she-wolf who mostly wanted her husband to pay attention. If Eleanor was a controlled fire, Isabella of France was more like a slow-burning candle that eventually set the whole tablecloth alight. Isabella was the daughter of Philip IV of France, the same Philip we gently explored earlier. The man built like an oak tree with the emotional warmth of one as well. She inherited his icy beauty and maybe about half of his talent for holding grudges. When Isabella was married off to Edward II of England, she was young, diplomatic, well-educated, and entirely unprepared for the reality of her new husband. Edward II was many things: a king, a gardener, a man who enjoyed rowing and thatching roofs with the enthusiasm of a medieval suburban dad, and a monarch with a talent for loving absolutely everyone except his wife. Isabella arrived in England expecting a partner. Instead, she found herself competing with a rotating cast of favorites, beginning with Piers Gaveston, who held Edward's attention with the gravitational pull of a small sun. Naturally, this caused problems. The English nobles were unamused by Gaveston's influence. Isabella was unamused by being ignored. Edward was unamused by literally everything except Gaveston. Eventually, Gaveston was executed by angry nobles. Edward mourned loudly. Isabella mourned silently, because frankly, she had finally gained some breathing room. But then Edward replaced Gaveston with Hugh Despenser, an even more irritating favorite. Despenser treated Isabella with open hostility, confiscated her lands, and humiliated her publicly. This was not sustainable. So Isabella did what any calmly pushed-to-the-edge medieval queen would do. She left England, found allies in France, fell into a partnership possibly romantic with Roger Mortimer, and invaded England. The invasion succeeded with almost suspicious ease. Edward II was deposed. Despenser was executed in ways we will not describe in detail, because this is a sleep-adjacent environment. Isabella ruled as regent for her teenage son, Edward III, until he eventually staged a coup of his own and took over. So Isabella retired quietly, surrounded by wealth, gardens, and the soft satisfaction of someone who absolutely got the last word. Joanna of Castile, La Loca, who was mostly just grieving. Now let's drift gently into the story of Joanna of Castile, known with unnecessary harshness as Joanna the Mad. As with many historical women who were described as mad, the truth is softer and far more tragic. Joanna was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the same power couple who completed the Reconquista and accidentally stumbled into sponsoring Columbus. Joanna was intelligent, multilingual, musically talented, and absolutely not expected to rule. She was the third child in a line of heirs, which meant she was destined for a quiet life as a political bride. But dynasties have a way of combusting when convenient. Her older siblings died, and suddenly Joanna was the future queen of Castile and Aragon. She had been married off to Philip the Handsome of Austria, who was indeed handsome in the same fragile, vaguely spoiled way a decorative vase might be. He enjoyed tournaments, fashion, admiration, and not, unfortunately, his wife, Joanna, however, loved him deeply. Too deeply, perhaps. Their marriage was passionate, volatile, and heavily strained by Philip's need for constant flirtation. He was the kind of man who could not pass a mirror without sighing lovingly at his own reflection. Joanna's reactions, jealousy, anger, grief were recorded by courtiers who found it easier to call her mad than acknowledge her humanity. Then Philip died suddenly, wandering the countryside with his coffin, refusing to bury him. Not because she was insane, but because she was grieving and politically isolated. Her father, Ferdinand, confined her for years to seize control of the kingdom. Her son, Charles V, continued the confinement to secure his own power. Joanna lived to an old age in quiet imprisonment, still politically useful, still underestimated, still more victim than villain. Her story reminds us gently that royalty was often a trap disguised as a crown. Let's drift forward. Anne of Cleves, the only Tudor wife who actually got a happy ending. Now we float into Tudor England, a place of dramatic politics and extremely unlucky wives. Anne of Cleves, wife number 4 of Henry VIII, was by comparison remarkably fortunate, which says less about her and more about the catastrophic fates of the others. Henry agreed to marry Anne after seeing her portrait, which, thanks to the artistic talents of Hans Holbein, presented her as a calm, attractive woman with soft features. Holbein, bless him, painted everyone in their best light. He was the medieval equivalent of a filter app. When Henry finally met Anne in person, he allegedly panicked. He disguised himself to surprise her romantically because he had read one too many chivalric romances. Anne did not recognize him because why on earth would she? Henry sulked for days. He complained that she wasn't as pretty as the portrait, as if he were a disappointed shopper leaving a one-star review. But Anne was practical, sensible, and entirely uninterested in drama. After 6 months, Henry annulled the marriage. Anne nodded politely, accepted a generous settlement, and proceeded to live her best Tudor life. She owned multiple palaces. She was financially secure, and crucially, she did not have to be married to Henry VIII. She outlived all his other wives, maintained friendly relations with his children, and spent her days in comfort. Sometimes, the happiest ending in history involves simply not being queen. If your eyelids are heavy now, perfect. If you're still clinging to consciousness, also fine. Just let yourself float a little as we continue drifting through the quieter corridors of monarchy, where gilded rooms were often the stage for fragile egos, messy marriages, and endless petty quarrels. Tonight, we'll explore a few more royals whose lives were defined less by triumph and more by human vulnerability, wrapped in velvet and gold. No wars, no revolutions, just the gentle, inevitable unraveling of dynasties and personal expectations. So settle in, adjust your blanket, and let the soft voice of history lull you as we drift onward. Prince George of Denmark, the quiet consort who mostly watched. George of Denmark is a perfect example of the royal who did everything right and was largely forgotten. He married Anne, Queen of England, in the late 17th century. A political marriage arranged to secure alliances, and somehow it worked. George was intelligent, loyal, and devoted, but also painfully shy. He lacked the ambition or temperament to assert himself in the cutthroat world of court politics. Instead, he quietly supported and attended meetings without complaint and generally kept out of trouble. Unfortunately for him, Anne's life was filled with tragedy. Several miscarriages, infant deaths, and political pressure that could overwhelm even the strongest of hearts. George's calm, steady presence was a comfort, though largely unremarked in the historical record. He died before Anne, quietly, of gout complications. A man who never caused scandal, never tried to be the center of attention, and somehow became invisible in the story of one of England's most eventful reigns. Sometimes being too competent is almost tragic. Marie Antoinette, the queen who really wanted a garden party. Marie Antoinette, France's favorite scapegoat, and one of history's most misunderstood queens. She was young when she arrived at Versailles, barely 14, expected to produce heirs and charm the French court simultaneously, which, if you think about it, is a lot for anyone, let alone a teenager thrust into a glittering palace where every minor mistake could become headline news. She liked fashion, music, and gardens. She adored her children. And she threw parties that became legendary because, yes, having fun was apparently a crime when you're Queen of France. Her reputation for extravagance was both deserved and exaggerated. While she spent money on gowns and jewels, She also lived in a palace filled with advisors who recommended budgets she often had little control over. When the revolution came, Marie Antoinette's life turned tragic. She was imprisoned, separated from her children, and ultimately executed. Her death became a symbol of the monarchy's downfall, even as she herself had spent most of her life simply trying to navigate the impossible expectations placed upon her. A reminder that privilege doesn't necessarily equal control. Prince Frederick of Prussia, the man with a very complicated family. Let's drift north to Prussia, land of militaristic discipline and meticulous uniforms. Prince Frederick, the son of Frederick William I, grew up under a father who preferred whippings to compliments. Discipline was not optional. Affection was rarer than a summer snowstorm. Frederick adored music, philosophy, and literature. His father adored soldiers, drills, and yelling. This mismatch created a young prince who was brilliant, but anxious, socially awkward, and constantly under threat of physical punishment. Eventually, Frederick fled his family, staged an attempted escape, and nearly lost his life in the process. He survived, though, and later became Frederick the Great, King of Prussia. Ironically, he used the exact kind of cunning his father had tried to suppress in him, turning anxiety into strategy, music into diplomacy, and family trauma into brilliant governance. Even a prince who barely survived his childhood could end up shaping history. Let's drift softly to Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the queen everyone secretly loved. Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz became Queen of Prussia during the early 19th century. She was beautiful, intelligent, unusual combination for someone surrounded by the rigid expectations of European courts. When Napoleon invaded, she became a symbol of national resistance, charming allies and citizens alike with her calm dignity. She rarely made political blunders, rarely angered ministers, and somehow maintained warmth in a world of suspicion. Tragically, Louise died young, at just 34, of tuberculosis. Her death sent waves of grief throughout Prussia, not for her political maneuvering, but for the quiet grace she brought into a world that often valued noise over kindness. Her life is a gentle reminder that sometimes influence comes not from force, but from quiet resilience. And finally, tonight, we drift toward Princess Charlotte of Wales, a life cut to short. Princess Charlotte, the only legitimate child of George IV, carried enormous expectations. Britain's hope for the future rested on her shoulders. She was lively, intelligent, and stubborn. Her father was neglectful, her mother controlling, and her court filled with intrigue. Charlotte fell in love with Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, a match she genuinely wanted. But despite her happiness, tragedy awaited. She died in childbirth at the age of 21, along with her son. The nation mourned profoundly, because she represented the bright future everyone had pinned their hopes on, and that future vanished in a single day. Her death is a quiet reminder of how precarious royal life could be, even when it seemed like privilege guaranteed safety. A gentle reflection before we drift to sleep tonight. We've wandered through the lives of royals who were fragile, human, and sometimes heartbreakingly ordinary, despite extraordinary circumstances. George of Denmark, quietly faithful. Marie Antoinette, longing for gardens instead of guillotines. Prince Frederick, who survived a brutal childhood to become a remarkable king. Louise, whose grace outshone political turmoil. Charlotte, whose life ended too soon. Each story is different, each life filled with hopes, anxieties, and small rebellions against impossible expectations. As the candlelight fades in your mind's eye, let their palaces dissolve into shadows. Let the weight of crowns and expectations drift quietly away. And let yourself rest